2,500 years. And still, that turns out to be enough. There is a silence that belongs only to the desert, not the silence of emptiness, but of waiting. A silence that holds its breath, that keeps its secrets folded deep beneath layers of sand and stone and time. It is in this silence that Egypt speaks most clearly, and it is from this silence that one boy, above all others, still reaches across 33 centuries to touch us. His name was Tutankhamun. Say it slowly, and you begin to understand something about the ancient world. That even a name carried weight, carried meaning, carried the will of the gods themselves. Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, a name that was in itself a declaration, a restoration, a promise made to an entire civilization that had been shaken very nearly to its foundations. He was 9 years old when they placed the double crown upon his head. 9 years old, and the fate of the most powerful empire on earth rested in his small hands. We do not know exactly what he looked like in those first days. A slight boy, we believe, with a narrow frame and a face still soft with childhood. He walked with a cane, evidence now suggests, due to a malformed foot. A condition he had carried since birth, one that would have made the long ceremonial processions of royal life quietly difficult. And yet he walked them. He sat upon the throne. He wore the golden mask of kingship and greeted the morning sun as pharaoh, as God, as the living bridge between heaven and the people of the Nile. To understand how a child came to inherit such a burden, we must first understand the world into which he was born. Egypt, in the years just before Tutankhamun's reign, had been a kingdom in crisis. His father, almost certainly the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten, had done something extraordinary, something that the Egyptian people found deeply unsettling. He had dismantled an entire religious order. The gods of Egypt, Amun, Osiris, Isis, the great and ancient pantheon, had been swept aside. In their place, Akhenaten proclaimed a single, all-powerful deity, the Aten, the disk of the sun. Temples were closed, priests were displaced. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. The city of Thebes, spiritual heart of the empire, was abandoned in favor of a new capital built from nothing in the desert. A gleaming, isolated city called Akhetaten, which we know today as Amarna. It was a revolution. And like most revolutions, it left deep wounds. When Akhenaten died, and the precise circumstances of his death remain, to this day, beautifully unresolved. Egypt was fractured. The priesthood was angry. The army was restless. The people, caught between a god they had been told to forget and gods they had never stopped believing in, were confused and quietly afraid. Into this world, Tutankhamun was born. Likely around 3041 BCE. The son, it is widely believed, of Akhenaten and a lesser wife, perhaps a woman called Kia, though even this remains uncertain. His original name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, a name that bore his father's religious fingerprints, a name that, within the first years of his reign, he would change. That change of name tells us everything. When Tutankhamun came to power, he was guided, and we should be honest about this, by men far older and far more experienced than himself. Two figures stand immediately at his side in the historical record, and both of them loom enormously. The first was an elderly statesman and advisor of remarkable political longevity, a man who had navigated the courts of multiple pharaohs, and who understood, better than almost anyone, how to survive. The second was Horemheb, the commander of the Egyptian military, ambitious, disciplined, and deeply loyal to the old order of things. These men guided the boy king's hand, but we should not make the mistake of thinking Tutankhamun was merely a puppet, a small figure dressed in gold while others pulled the strings. The decisions made in his name were significant ones. The temples of Amun were reopened. The old gods were restored. The capital returned, gradually, to Thebes. Egypt breathed again. His reign lasted only 9 years. He died around the age of 18 or 19. The cause still debated, still studied, still whispered over in laboratories and lecture halls across the world. A chariot accident, an infection, a genetic condition compounded by a broken leg. We do not know for certain. Perhaps we never will. And yet, here is the quiet miracle of it all. We know his face. We know the golden serenity of his burial mask. We know the rooms of his tomb, sealed for over 3,000 years until a November morning in 1922, when an archaeologist named Howard Carter peered through a narrow hole in the darkness and, by candlelight, saw something that made him fall completely still. When asked if he could see anything, Carter replied, in words that have never lost their power, "Yes, wonderful things." What those wonderful things tell us about a boy who ruled an ancient world. That is the story we are here to tell. Settle in. The desert has kept these secrets for a very long time. It is happy now to share them. Before there was a king, there was a child. And before there was a child, there was a city. A city that should never have existed, built by a man who believed he alone had heard the voice of God. To truly know Tutankhamun, you must first know Amarna. You must stand, at least in your imagination, on the eastern bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between the great cities of Memphis and Thebes, and look out across a broad, flat plain cupped by limestone cliffs on 3 sides. There is nothing here. There was nothing here. No ancient settlement, no sacred history, no reason whatsoever to build. And that, to Akhenaten, was precisely the point. He chose this empty place because it belonged to no other god. It was unclaimed land, virgin desert, and upon it he would raise a city dedicated entirely to the Aten. He called it Akhetaten, horizon of the sun disk, and he built it with breathtaking speed, commanding an army of workers to raise temples, palaces, administrative buildings, and residential quarters from the pale desert stone. Within a few years, a city of perhaps 50,000 souls had risen from nothing, baking quietly in the Egyptian sun. This was the world into which the boy who would become Tutankhamun was born. We do not know the precise year with certainty. Scholars place it somewhere around 1341 BCE, and we know even less about the early circumstances of his life. His mother, as mentioned, remains a subject of considerable academic debate. For many years, a leading theory held that his mother was Kia, a secondary wife of Akhenaten about whom the historical record is frustratingly thin. She appears in reliefs, she bears titles of affection, and then, with very little explanation, she vanishes from the record entirely. Some have suggested she died in childbirth, others that she fell from royal favor. The truth, like so much of this story, has been swallowed by time. What we do know is that Tutankhamun, then called Tutankhaten, grew up as a royal prince inside the extraordinary, strange, and deeply unusual world of the Amarna court. And it was an unusual world, let that be said clearly. Akhenaten's religious revolution was not merely a theological adjustment. It was a total transformation of Egyptian culture, art, and daily life. The art of the Amarna period is immediately recognizable to anyone who has encountered it. Figures rendered with elongated skulls, soft bellies, wide hips, and an almost dreamlike naturalism that stands in complete contrast to the rigid, formal conventions of traditional Egyptian art. Pharaoh and queen are shown holding hands, playing with their daughters in domestic, sunlit scenes. The Aten, depicted not as a human or animal figure, as Egyptian gods typically were, but simply as the sun's disk, with rays ending in small human hands, reaches down to touch them with warmth and light. There is something tender about Amarna art, even now, something intimate, and perhaps that tenderness touched the boyhood of Tutankhamun in ways we can only guess at. He would have grown up surrounded by the daughters of Akhenaten and his great royal wife, the luminous and formidable Nefertiti. 6 daughters, no confirmed sons. Though Tutankhamun existed, and perhaps 1 or 2 other male children whose fates remain unclear, the royal family lived within the great palace complex at Akhenaten, a sprawling structure of painted halls and open courtyards, with a private royal road connecting palace to temple, all of it oriented toward the sun. The boy would have been educated. He would have learned to read the hieroglyphic script, to write in the flowing cursive hand known as hieratic, to understand the mathematics of administration, the language of diplomacy, the rituals of kingship. He would have been taught to drive a chariot, something the evidence of his tomb later confirms quite powerfully, given the extraordinary number of chariots and riding equipment buried with him. He would have learned to hunt, to shoot a bow, to present himself with the composure that the role of royalty demanded. And all around him, invisible to a child's eyes but unmistakable to the historians, the world was quietly coming apart, because Akhenaten's revolution, for all its artistic beauty and philosophical ambition, was practically a disaster. The priesthood of Amun, wealthy, organized, deeply embedded in Egyptian society, had been stripped of their temples, their income, their purpose, and their power. They did not forget this. They could not forget this. The administrative machinery of Egypt, long intertwined with religious institutions, grew strained. Evidence from what is known as the Amarna letters, a remarkable archive of diplomatic correspondence discovered in the 19th century, suggests that Egypt's relationships with its vassal states and regional allies were deteriorating during this period. Appeals for military support went unanswered, or were answered too slowly. The empire, though still vast and formidable, was showing hairline cracks. And then, within a period of just a few years, catastrophe arrived in waves. Nefertiti, at some point, either died or stepped sideways from her role in a manner the record does not clearly explain. A mysterious figure known as Smenkhkare appears briefly as a co-regent, and then disappears just as suddenly. And then Akhenaten himself was gone, dead, perhaps around 1336 BCE, leaving behind a transformed kingdom, a resentful priesthood, a restless military, and a city built from devotion that the rest of Egypt had never truly accepted. Into this vacuum stepped a 9-year-old boy, Tutankhamun, slight, young, walking with a cane, we now believe, due to the choler disease that had affected the bone in his left foot, a condition that would have caused him real and ongoing discomfort throughout his short life. He was, in almost every measurable sense, an unlikely candidate to hold together an empire. And yet, there is something important to consider here, something that the modern imagination sometimes overlooks when it pictures a child king being steered entirely by adult advisors. Ancient Egypt had an extraordinarily sophisticated system of royal presentation and divine legitimacy. The pharaoh was not merely a political figure. The pharaoh was, in Egyptian theology, the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, son of Osiris, and upon death would become Osiris himself, joining the eternal cycle of life, death, and resurrection. The person inside the crown mattered less, in some respects, than the institution the crown represented. In other words, a 9-year-old pharaoh was still a pharaoh, still a god on earth, still the axis around which Egyptian society oriented itself. And the men around Tutankhamun understood this perfectly. I, who held the title of vizier, essentially the prime minister of the Egyptian state, was a man of deep experience and quiet cunning, He had served under Amenhotep III, under Akhenaten, and now stood at the elbow of a child king with the steady patience of a man who understood that power, properly managed, endures. He was old, he was shrewd, and he had, perhaps, a personal stake in the proceedings that went beyond mere loyalty. Some scholars have proposed that I was the father of Nefertiti herself, which would have made him a grandfather figure to the royal household, though this connection remains debated. Beside I stood Horemheb, and Horemheb was a different kind of man entirely. Where I was the political mind, Horemheb was the military spine. He had risen through the ranks of the Egyptian army on the strength of genuine talent, and by the time of Tutankhamun's reign he held the title of Commander-in-Chief, a position that, in an empire maintained by military force across vast territories, carried enormous real-world authority. Horemheb was deeply conservative, deeply traditional, and deeply hostile to the Amarna experiment. He wanted Egypt restored. He wanted the old order returned, and he was willing to work within the framework of a child king's reign to make that happen. Together, I and Horemheb shaped the early decisions of Tutankhamun's kingship, and the most visible of those decisions, the one that announced the new direction of Egypt to everyone who needed to hear it, was a change of name. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. The Aten was set aside, Amun was restored, and with that single act of renaming, an entire ideology was, at least officially, reversed. The boy from Amarna had become the restorer of Egypt's soul. He had not yet turned 10 years old. There is a particular quality to Egyptian gold that artists and archaeologists have remarked upon for generations. It does not dull, it does not tarnish. Leave it in the ground for 3,000 years, seal it in darkness, bury it beneath stone and sand, and the accumulated silence of 30 centuries. And when you bring it back into the light, it gleams as though it was worked and polished yesterday. There is something almost defiant about it, something that refuses, absolutely, to submit to the passage of time. In this way, Egyptian gold is not unlike Egyptian kingship itself. The institution of the pharaoh was ancient even when Tutankhamun inherited it. By the time the double crown was placed upon his small head, the white crown of Upper Egypt nested within the red crown of Lower Egypt, together symbolizing the unified kingdom of the Nile. That institution was already more than 1,500 years old. Generations of kings had worn it, fought beneath it, built beneath it, and died within its embrace. The rituals surrounding the pharaoh, the ceremonies of daily life at court, the elaborate protocols of audience and worship and governance, all of it had been refined across centuries into something of extraordinary precision and beauty. And now a child was asked to inhabit it. The early years of Tutankhamun's reign were, in the most practical sense, a government of restoration. The damage done by the Amarna period was real, and it was extensive, and it needed to be addressed with both symbolic urgency and administrative care. The renaming of the king was only the beginning. What followed was a systematic, carefully orchestrated dismantling of Akhenaten's legacy. Not violent, not frenzied, but deliberate and thorough. The way one removes a thorn from deep in the flesh, the temples of Amun were reopened. This was not a simple administrative gesture. These were enormous complexes. Karnak above all, at Thebes, a temple that had been growing and expanding for centuries and that represented, in stone and gold and painted column, the beating religious heart of Egyptian civilization. To reopen these temples was to signal to the priesthood, to the people, to the gods themselves, that the aberration was over, that Egypt had come home. And with the temples came the priests, thousands of them, men who had been displaced, humiliated, stripped of income and purpose and sacred role during the Amarna years. They returned now to their positions, their rituals reinstated, their authority restored. the economic machinery that surrounded the temples, the farms, the workshops, the breweries and bakeries that supplied the daily offerings. All of it began to turn again. There is a document that survives from Tutankhamun's reign, known today as the Restoration Stela, and it is one of the most valuable texts we possess from this period. Carved in stone and originally erected at Karnak, it speaks in the voice of the pharaoh, or at least in the voice constructed for him by those who governed in his name. And it describes the state of Egypt before the restoration in terms that are deliberately, almost dramatically bleak. The temples, it says, had fallen into ruin. The gods had turned their backs. When armies went out to fight, they returned with nothing. When prayers were offered, no divine ear received them. Egypt, in the language of the Stela, was a kingdom abandoned by heaven. And then, the king acted. The king restored. The king healed. Whether a 9 or 10-year-old boy composed the single word of that text is, of course, entirely beside the point. What the stela represents is the official narrative of a reign, the story that Egypt's new government wanted told, inscribed in stone so that it would endure. And the story they chose to tell was one of divine rescue, of a young king touched by the gods, who had turned the ship of state away from the rocks and back toward calmer waters. It is propagandist, certainly, but it is also, in its broad strokes, historically accurate. Egypt did stabilize under Tutankhamun. The religious economy did recover. The administrative structures that had been strained and distorted during the Amarna years began to function again with something approaching their old efficiency. This was not magic. It was the result of capable men, Horemheb, and a network of experienced officials beneath them, applying steady hands to the levers of a very old and very complex state. But the image of the king mattered too. Never underestimate that. In ancient Egypt, the image of the king was not decoration. It was theology. Tutankhamun, even as a child, was depicted in the full regalia of divine kingship. He appears in the art of his reign, smiting enemies, offering to gods, presiding over ceremonies of cosmic significance. The art produced during his reign is notably warmer and more naturalistic than the rigid formalism of the pre-Amarna period. A residue, perhaps, of the Amarna aesthetic that had, despite everything, introduced something genuinely new into Egyptian visual culture. But the content of that art is entirely traditional, entirely orthodox. The boy king is shown as his predecessors were shown, powerful, serene, eternal. He was also, around this time, married. His wife was Ankhesenamun, and her story is one of the quietly heartbreaking threads woven through the fabric of this reign. She was the third daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, which made her Tutankhamun's half-sister, a form of royal marriage that was not unusual in ancient Egypt and carried deep religious significance regarding the purity of the bloodline. She was older than her husband, perhaps 3 or 4 years older, and she had already lived through more upheaval than most people encounter in a lifetime. She had grown up in Amarna. She had watched her father's revolution and her mother's grandeur. She had seen the city emptied, the names chiseled away from monuments, the world she knew dismantled piece by piece. And now she was queen of a kingdom that had officially decided to forget the world she came from. 2 pregnancies are recorded during the marriage of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. Neither child survived. 2 mummified fetuses were discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb when it was opened in 1922. 2 daughters, delivered prematurely, placed in small gilded coffins and buried with their father. It is one of the most quietly devastating details of this entire story. A young couple, already carrying the weight of a kingdom's restoration, privately bearing the grief of children who never drew breath. What the relationship between Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun actually felt like, whether there was warmth between them, affection, genuine companionship, We cannot say with any certainty, but the objects left in his tomb suggest something. Among the thousands of exquisite items sealed within those chambers is a small golden shrine, its panels decorated with intimate domestic scenes. The king and queen together, hunting, exchanging flowers, relaxing in gardens. She hands him arrows. He pours water into her cupped hands. They face each other with an ease, a closeness that does not look like performance. Perhaps it was not. Beyond the personal, the rain carried forward into the world of foreign affairs, and here the picture grows somewhat more complicated. Egypt, under Akhenaten, had allowed certain relationships with neighboring powers to fray, and the work of repairing them was slow. Horemheb conducted military campaigns in Nubia and in the Levant during this period, and there is evidence of Egyptian military activity in Syria, though the scale and success of these campaigns remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What is clear is that Egypt was reasserting itself, reminding its neighbors, gently but firmly, that the empire was still present, still watching. There are images of Tutankhamun as a warrior king, carved, painted, gilded, that show him in his chariot, bow drawn, enemies falling beneath his horse's hooves. Whether the young pharaoh ever personally led troops into battle is genuinely uncertain. The physical evidence of his body suggests someone whose mobility was limited by his foot condition, but the image of the warrior pharaoh was essential. It had to exist. It had to be proclaimed in stone, regardless of what happened in the field, because in Egypt, the image was never merely a record of what had occurred. The image was a declaration of what must be eternally true. And so Tutankhamun rode, endlessly, in gold and paint and carved relief, across the walls of temples and the surfaces of chests and the panels of golden shrines. He rode through battles that may or may not have happened. He offered to gods whose temples he had restored. He stood, serene and ageless, in the posture of divine kingship that Egypt had perfected over 15 centuries. And somewhere inside all of that gilded imagery, somewhere behind the ceremonial beard and the crook and the flail and the double crown, a boy was growing up. A boy who was running out of time. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only bones can hold. Words decay. Papyrus crumbles. Stone gets chiseled over, repainted, deliberately erased by those who come after and wish to revise the story. But bones carry their own archive. They record illness and injury, childhood hardship and adult strain, genetic inheritance, and the accumulated physical cost of a life lived in a particular body, in a particular time, under particular pressures. Bones do not editorialize. They do not serve a political agenda. They simply remember. And the bones of Tutankhamun have, over the past several decades, told us things that no inscription ever could. He died young. This much has always been known. The Egyptian king lists, the astronomical calculations of scholars, the careful layering of archaeological evidence, all of it points to a reign of roughly 9 to 10 years, beginning around 1332 BCE and ending somewhere around 1323 BCE. He was, at the time of his death, between 18 and 20 years old. A young man barely emerged from boyhood, standing at the threshold of an adulthood he would never fully inhabit. For a long time, the question of how he died was answered with confident simplicity. He was murdered. The story was clean, dramatic, satisfying in the way that historical mysteries often are when they resolve into human villainy. A blow to the back of the head, some early analyses of his skull suggested. An assassination, orchestrated perhaps by Ai or by Horemheb, or by persons unknown who stood to gain from the removal of a young king and the elevation of someone more pliable, more useful, more entirely their own. It was a compelling story. It was also, in all likelihood, wrong. modern forensic analysis, and Tutankhamun's mummy has been subjected to more scientific scrutiny than almost any other ancient human remains on Earth, has largely moved away from the murder hypothesis. The damage to the back of his skull, which drove so much of the early speculation, appears now to have occurred after death, most probably during the mummification process or in the long centuries of burial. The embalmers were not always gentle. The tomb raiders who preceded Howard Carter were certainly not. And 3,000 years of pressure and decay do considerable work of their own. What the bones do show is something more complex and, in its way, more poignant than a clean assassination. Tutankhamun was not a healthy young man. Genetic analysis conducted in the early years of the 21st century, a landmark study published in 2010, drawing on DNA extracted from his mummy and those of several related individuals found in the Valley of the Kings, revealed a picture of significant inherited fragility. He was the product of a royal family that had, for generations, practiced sibling and close cousin marriage in the name of blood purity. The genetic consequences of this practice had accumulated quietly across those generations, and by the time they reached Tutankhamun, they were considerable. He had at least 2 distinct forms of malaria detectable in his remains. Not one infection, but multiple, suggesting a body that struggled persistently with the disease. He had the already noted condition affecting the bones of his left foot, known as curler disease, which caused avascular necrosis, a gradual dying of bone tissue due to interrupted blood supply. The result was a foot that was partially collapsed, painful, and functionally limited. Supporting this, his tomb contained no fewer than 130 walking sticks and canes, not ceremonial items, not decorative objects, but well-worn, practically used tools of daily mobility. He also showed evidence of a cleft palate, of a slightly feminized skeletal structure, wider hips, more delicate bone architecture, which echoes the physical presentations of other Amarna period royals, and may reflect either genuine genetic expression or simply the artistic conventions of an era that depicted its kings in deliberately androgynous terms. The distinction is difficult to untangle, even with modern tools. What emerges from all of this is the portrait of a young man who moved through his short life in a body that required management, accommodation, and quiet determination. Every ceremonial procession was an exercise in endurance. Every public appearance demanded that he present himself as the physical embodiment of divine health and power, while privately navigating real and ongoing pain. There is something in that which deserves a moment of stillness. He did it anyway, day after day, year after year, in the heat of the Egyptian sun, wearing the heavy regalia of kingship, performing the rituals of a civilization that depended on his visible perfection. He did it anyway. Whatever private arrangements were made, whatever accommodations were quietly built into the schedule of a royal day, the outward face of Tutankhamun remained composed, serene, unchanging, as gold is unchanging. The most likely cause of his death, current scholarly consensus suggests, was a combination of factors converging in a short period of time. A broken left leg, detected in the bone, showing signs of rapid onset trauma, likely suffered in a fall, possibly from a chariot. A leg that, in a body already compromised by malaria and bone disease and the accumulated stress of genetic fragility, could not heal properly. Infection would have followed. In an age without antibiotics, without the most basic tools of modern medicine, a bone infection in a compromised body was frequently a death sentence, even for a king. He may have lingered for days. He may have lingered for weeks. We do not know how much he understood of what was happening. We do not know whether he was afraid. What we know is that he died without a male heir, that the 2 daughters buried with him represented the beginning and end of his direct line, that the great royal wife Tutankhamun, still young, still alive, now suddenly a widow and a queen without a king, was left in a position of extraordinary vulnerability. And here the historical record offers us one of its most haunting documents. Among the archives of the Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival power to the north, centered in what is now modern Turkey, there exists a letter known today as the Zananza Affair. It was written by an Egyptian queen to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, and its contents are remarkable. The queen, almost certainly Ankhesenamun, though some debate remains, writes to say that her husband has died, that she has no son, and that she is afraid. She asks the Hittite king to send her one of his sons to be her husband. She would make him king of Egypt. She wanted, the letter makes plain, not to be handed to a servant. She did not want to marry a man already of her own court. She did not want, one reads between those careful lines, to marry I. Suppiluliuma, astonished. And who could blame him? For this was without precedent. Sent envoys to verify the request before committing. He received a second letter, more urgent, more desperate in its undertone. He sent a son. Prince Zananza crossed into Egyptian territory. He never arrived. He was killed. By whom, under whose orders, in what exact circumstances we do not know. But the result was clear enough. The diplomatic gambit failed. The Hittites were furious. And in Egypt, the succession proceeded along the path that the letter had tried so desperately to avoid. I became pharaoh. He was, by this point, an old man, likely in his 70s. His reign lasted only 4 years. But in those 4 years he performed one act of kingship that sealed his place in the story of Tutankhamun permanently and irrevocably. It was I who oversaw the burial. I, who appears in the paintings on the wall of Tutankhamun's tomb, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony, the sacred rite by which the deceased's senses were restored for the afterlife, traditionally performed by the new king upon the old. By depicting himself in that role, I accomplished something elegant and ruthless in equal measure. He legitimized his own succession, he demonstrated his authority, and he ensured that when anyone looked upon those tomb walls, they would see not only a dead boy king, but the living man who had chosen to bury him, and in burying him had claimed his throne. Tutankhamun was wrapped in linen, anointed with oils and resins, adorned with amulets and jewels and golden objects of staggering beauty, fitted with that extraordinary mask, the one that would become, 3,000 years later, the most recognized face in all of ancient history, placed in a nest of coffins, the innermost of solid gold, and sealed within a quartzite sarcophagus, and surrounded by rooms filled with the provisions of eternity. And then the doors were closed, and the desert sealed itself over him, and the world, for a very long time, forgot that he had ever existed at all. There is a place in Egypt that the ancient Egyptians called Taset Art, the Great Place. We know it today as the Valley of the Kings, a remote, sun-bleached ravine cut into the limestone hills on the west bank of the Nile, directly across the river from the ancient city of Thebes. It is not a beautiful place in any conventional sense. There are no trees, no water, no shade worth speaking of. The cliffs rise steeply on all sides, pale and stark and severe, and the sun strikes the valley floor with a ferocity that makes the air itself seem to shimmer and bend. In the full heat of an Egyptian afternoon, the Valley of the Kings feels like the edge of the world. That was, of course, entirely the point. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, the dynasty that includes Tutankhamun, Ramesses the Great, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and dozens of others, chose this remote, inhospitable ravine as their eternal resting place for reasons both practical and deeply symbolic. The west bank of the Nile was the land of the dead in Egyptian theology, the place where the sun descended each evening into the underworld. The cliffs above the valley contained a natural pyramid-shaped peak, which the Egyptians called the Peak, or Ta de Hente. A mountain they believed was sacred, a stone triangle pointing eternally toward heaven, and the valley itself was remote enough, they hoped, to defeat the tomb robbers who had systematically plundered the great pyramid complexes of earlier dynasties. They were, on this last point, almost entirely wrong. By the time the ancient world gave way to the medieval, and the medieval to the modern, virtually every royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings had been entered and emptied. The robbers came in waves, sometimes within years of a burial, sometimes within decades. The priests who guarded the royal necropolis eventually moved the mummies of the most important pharaohs into hidden caches for protection, where they lay in anonymous darkness for thousands of years. The valley became a tourist attraction in Greco-Roman times, its walls scratched with the graffiti of curious visitors. It was mapped, explored, written about, dug into. By the early 20th century, the general scholarly consensus was that the Valley of the Kings had given up everything it had to give. One man disagreed. Howard Carter was not, by nature, a man who attracted easy affection. He was stubborn, meticulous, frequently difficult, prone to conflict with the authorities that employed him, and possessed of a certainty about his own professional judgments that his peers found alternately impressive and infuriating. He had come to Egypt as a young man in his late teens, initially as an artist employed to copy tomb paintings, and he had never really left. The country had taken hold of him in the way that Egypt takes hold of certain people, completely, permanently, like the desert absorbing water. He had been working in and around the Valley of the Kings for years, and he had developed a conviction based on fragmentary evidence, careful reasoning, and something that, in a less disciplined man, might have been called instinct. That one tomb remained undiscovered. The tomb of a minor king, a boy pharaoh from the late 18th dynasty whose name appeared in scattered references, but whose burial place had never been identified. Tutankhamun. The problem was money. Excavation on any serious scale required a patron, and patrons were not unlimited in their patience. Carter's patron was George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat who had come to Egyptian archaeology through the somewhat indirect route of ill health. Carnarvon had suffered serious injuries in a motoring accident in Germany in 1901 and had been advised by his doctors to winter in warmer climates. Egypt had suited him, and the archaeology of Egypt had, gradually, consumed him. By the early 1920s, Carnarvon's patience with the Valley of the Kings was wearing thin. He had been funding Carter's work there for years, and the valley had yielded relatively little of significance. He informed Carter that the 1922 season would be the last he was prepared to finance. Carter asked for one more chance, one final excavation in an area of the valley floor he had not yet been able to properly explore, a section cluttered with the debris of earlier digs, particularly the workmen's huts associated with the tomb of Ramses VI. He had always suspected that something lay beneath them. Carnarvon agreed. Work began in early November 1922. On the 4th of November, just 3 days into the new season, a young water boy attached to the excavation team stumbled upon something in the ground beneath his feet. A stone step, cut into the bedrock, leading downward. Carter uncovered it carefully, then uncovered the step beneath it, and then the one beneath that, until a staircase of 16 steps descended into the earth and ended at a plastered doorway, sealed with ancient mud and bearing the unmistakable cartouche impressions of royal necropolis officials. He sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. It was, in its restraint, one of the great understatements in the history of human discovery. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Carnarvon arrived on the 23rd of November with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. The staircase was cleared again. the doorway was exposed again. And then, on the 26th of November, 1922, Howard Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of that sealed doorway, inserted a candle into the darkness beyond it, and looked through. What he encountered on the other side of that wall had been waiting, undisturbed, for 3,200 years. The room beyond, what would become known as the antechamber, was filled. Absolutely, overwhelmingly, impossibly filled. Golden couches in the shapes of strange animals, their eyes inlaid with glass. Dismantled chariots piled against the walls. Alabaster vessels, their carved surfaces glowing in the candlelight. Wooden boxes and baskets. A gilded throne. Statues of the king standing sentinel, black and gold, watching the entrance with the calm authority of guardians who had stood their post for 3 millennia and were not particularly surprised to find themselves interrupted. Carnarvon, standing behind Carter in the narrow corridor, asked the question, "Can you see anything?" And Carter, who was not, by all accounts, a sentimental man, who was not given to grand gestures or theatrical pronouncements, replied in words that have echoed through every subsequent telling of this story with the resonance of something larger than the moment that produced them. Yes, wonderful things. The world that received this news in the weeks and months that followed received it with a hunger that surprised even those at the center of the discovery. Egypt had been generating archaeological excitement for over a century by this point. Napoleon's expedition, the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone, the great temple clearances of the 19th century had all produced their waves of public fascination, but nothing had prepared anyone for Tutankhamun. Perhaps it was the completeness of it. Every other royal tomb in the valley had been robbed, emptied, stripped of its humanity. What Carter found in KV-62, the tomb's official designation, was a burial that had been entered twice in antiquity by robbers who took relatively little and were apparently disturbed before they could finish, and then resealed and left alone for 32 centuries. What lay inside was not merely treasure. It was the complete material world of an Egyptian king, preserved with extraordinary fidelity, waiting in the darkness as though time itself had simply paused at the moment of sealing and declined to resume. The clearance of the tomb took Carter and his team nearly a decade of painstaking, meticulous, room-by-room documentation. Every object photographed, measured, catalogued, conserved before being moved. The antechamber, the annex, the treasury, and finally, the burial chamber itself, where the nested shrines filled the space almost entirely. Gilded cedar panels fitted so precisely that Carter had to partially dismantle them in the narrow room to understand how they had been assembled in the first place. Within those shrines, within the quartzite sarcophagus, within the 3 nested coffins, the innermost of solid gold and weighing over 240 pounds, lay the mummy of the king, wearing the mask that the world would come to know as the face of ancient Egypt. The mask is 49 centimeters tall. It is fashioned from 2 layers of beaten gold. The eyes are inlaid with obsidian and quartz, the eyebrows and eyelids with lapis lazuli, the broad collar with turquoise and carnelian in colored glass. The expression it wears is one of absolute, untroubled calm, the serenity not of indifference, but of completion, of a face that has arrived where it was always going, and found the destination entirely acceptable. It is, by almost any measure, the single most recognizable object produced by any human civilization in the whole of recorded history. And it was made for a teenager, made to accompany a boy who had ruled for 9 years in a damaged kingdom, who had walked on a broken foot through the ceremonies of divinity, who had buried 2 daughters and worn the weight of a double crown, and presided over the restoration of a civilization's soul, and who had died, in the end, in the way that many young and fragile people die. Not dramatically, not in battle, not in the grip of conspiracy, quietly. The body simply giving way at last to everything it had been asked to bear. Every story needs an ending. But the story of Tutankhamun is one of those rare historical narratives that refuses, with quiet stubbornness, to conclude. It keeps opening outward. Every answer produces three new questions. Every door that Carter's team unsealed revealed not just a room, but an entirely new corridor of inquiry stretching away into the dark. And even now, more than a century after that November evening, when candlelight first fell again on golden faces and alabaster jars, and the serene black sentinels standing watch, even now, the boy king keeps yielding new secrets. This is, perhaps, the most remarkable thing about him. Not the gold, not the mask, not the extraordinary accident of preservation that delivered his tomb to us so nearly intact, while the centuries stripped everything else bare. The most remarkable thing about Tutankhamun is his persistence, his refusal to become merely historical, his insistence on remaining, against all odds and across all distance, somehow present. Let us begin with what happened after Carter. The years following the discovery of KB62 were not, for those most closely involved, uniformly triumphant. Lord Carnarvon, who had waited so long, funded so patiently, and arrived in time to stand behind Carter in that corridor and hear those two quiet words, did not live to see the tomb fully cleared. He died in Cairo in April 1923, less than 5 months after the opening of the antechamber, from blood poisoning following an infected mosquito bite. He was 57 years old. The timing was, from a journalistic standpoint, irresistible. The popular press. And this was an era when the popular press had perfected the art of feeding public appetite with exactly the story the public wished to consume. Seized upon his death with gleeful speed, the curse of the pharaohs was born. Ancient warnings were invented or embellished. Coincidences were collected and arranged into patterns. The fact that Howard Carter himself lived until 1939, hale and professionally active for another 16 years after the discovery, was quietly set aside as inconvenient. The curse was a story, and the story of Tutankhamun, it turned out, was something the modern world could not get enough of. Egyptomania was not new in 1922. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign had triggered a wave of it in the early 19th century. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 had produced another, but the Tutankhamun discovery arrived at a particular cultural moment. The early 1920s, the Jazz Age, the period of restless modernity that followed the devastation of the First World War. And it landed with the force of something the era specifically needed. Here was beauty. Here was mystery. Here was a civilization of extraordinary refinement, preserved in gold and lapis lazuli, reaching across 3,000 years to offer the exhausted modern world something ancient and permanent and untouched by the catastrophes of recent memory. The aesthetic influence was immediate and lasting. Art Deco, the dominant decorative style of the 1920s and 1930s, absorbed the visual language of Tutankhamun's treasures with open arms. The geometric precision, the bold use of gold and black, the stylized animal forms, the sense of elegant order, all of it flowed directly from the images coming out of KV62 and into the design studios of Paris and New York and London. You can see it in the architecture of the Chrysler Building, in the jewelry of Cartier, in the lobbies of cinemas and the covers of magazines, and the decorative ironwork of apartment buildings from Manhattan to Melbourne. A dead Egyptian boy changed the way the modern world looked, and the fascination did not diminish. It deepened. In 1968, a team from the University of Liverpool X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy and reignited the debate about his cause of death. The bone fragments detected in his skull sent the murder hypothesis surging back through the popular imagination, and it stayed there for decades. In 1978, the treasures of Tutankhamun toured the United States in an exhibition that drew over 8 million visitors, a number that remains extraordinary by any standard of museum attendance, before or since. People queued for hours. They came from thousands of miles away. They stood in front of objects made by human hands 33 centuries ago, and felt something that they struggled, many of them, to adequately name. Recognition, perhaps, or its close cousin, the shock of realizing that the distance between then and now is not, in the most important respects, nearly as great as we tend to assume. The DNA study of 2010 opened another chapter entirely. For the first time, science could speak directly to questions of parentage, of health, of the biological reality beneath the gilded surfaces. The results were humbling in their complexity. Here was a real person, genetically specific, physically particular, carrying in his cells the accumulated consequences of his family's choices across generations. Not a symbol, not an icon, a human being with a broken foot, and recurring malaria, and a cleft palate, and a genetic inheritance that made his short life quietly difficult from its very beginning. The more science looks at Tutankhamun, the more human he becomes. And that, perhaps, is the deepest source of his enduring hold on us. We have, across the centuries since his rediscovery, constructed a great deal around him. We have built exhibitions and documentaries and novels and films. We have sold replicas of his mask in gift shops on every continent. We have named hotels and restaurants and nightclubs and cosmetic products after him, as though his name were a brand rather than a person. We have, in short, done to him what celebrity culture does to everyone it touches. We have made him simultaneously enormous and abstract, a face without a life behind it. But the life was there. 9 years old, placed on the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, surrounded by men whose agendas he could not fully understand and whose guidance he could not fully refuse. A boy who changed his name as his first significant act of kingship, and in doing so signaled the restoration of an entire civilization's spiritual identity. A boy who walked on a broken foot through ceremonies of divine perfection, who buried his daughters in small gilded coffins and continued, the following morning, to be pharaoh, who sat on a golden throne in a painted hall and received the ambassadors of foreign kingdoms, while the men beside him managed the levers of power, and the kingdom slowly, painstakingly healed, who died at 18 or 19 from a broken leg and a fever, and the accumulated fragility of a body that had never been entirely well, who was wrapped in linen and gold and sealed into the earth and forgotten so completely that within a few generations his very name had been erased from the official record. Horemheb, who succeeded Ai and ruled for decades, stamping his own image across the monuments of Egypt with the thoroughness of a man determined to leave no room for anyone else, formally expunged the Amarna pharaohs from history, Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, i.e., all of them were removed from the king lists, their reigns attributed to Horemheb himself, their names chiseled away from the stones on which they had been carved. Tutankhamun was not merely dead, he was officially unmade. And yet, the tomb survived, sealed beneath the debris of a later excavation, invisible to the robbers who emptied every other royal burial in the valley, untouched by the priests who moved the great royal mummies to safety. It sat there, 30 feet below the surface of a bleached limestone ravine, for 3,200 years, while civilizations rose and fell above it, while the Greeks came and the Romans came, and the Arabs came, and the Ottomans came, and the modern world came with its maps and its theories and its competing claims to the valley's secrets. And on the 4th of November 1922, a water boy's foot found a stone step, and the world remembered. There is something in that arc, from the erasure to the rediscovery, from the chiseled away name to the most recognized face in human history. That feels almost too neat for history. History is rarely this symmetrical. It rarely delivers justice with such clean, dramatic timing. But occasionally, just occasionally, the long arc of time bends in a direction that feels, if not quite fair, then at least strangely appropriate. Tutankhamun was told, by the powerful men who came after him, that he had never existed. 3,000 years later, his face looks out from the cover of every book about ancient Egypt ever written. He was a minor king, a transitional figure, a brief interlude between the catastrophe of Amarna and the long stability of the Ramesside period by the conventional measures of historical importance. The length of his reign, the scale of his military campaigns, the monuments he built, the administrative changes he introduced. He does not rank among the great pharaohs. Thutmose III conquered an empire. Ramses II built half of Egypt in stone. Hatshepsut reigned for 20 years and traded with lands whose very locations scholars still debate. Tutankhamun reigned for 9 years, restored the temples, changed his name, buried his daughters, and died. And yet, here we are, still saying his name, still standing in museum galleries at midnight, gazing at his golden face, still asking, after a century of science and scholarship and documentary and debate, the questions that his short life keeps generating. What happened to him? What might he have become? What did he feel behind the golden mask, in the quiet moments when the ceremonies were over and the court had withdrawn, and the boy who was also a god was simply, briefly, alone? We do not know. We will never know. And that not knowing is not a failure of history. It is an invitation. It is the space that Tutankhamun has always occupied, the gap between the image and the person, between the gold and the flesh, between the eternal and the ordinary. And it is a space that human curiosity, across all the centuries, has found impossible to leave unfilled. The desert keeps its silence. But some silences, it turns out, speak louder than anything else.